So the entry point for the digestive system is the mouth. The mouth is responsible for ingestion, and it contains the teeth, tongue, and ducts from the salivary glands. The teeth and the tongue are very important players that help facilitate mechanical digestion, and the salivary glands will release saliva into the mouth that will quickly start the process of chemical digestion. The hard palate and the soft palate form the roof of the mouth, and the cheeks form the lateral walls of the mouth. The tongue will form the floor of the mouth, but is also very necessary for the manipulation of food, sensing taste, and for swallowing. Aside from the teeth and the tongue, we want to give most of our focus to the salivary glands that can be found in the mouth. There are 3 salivary glands that empty into different places in the mouth. We have the parotid glands, which can be found right here, just anterior and inferior to the ear. We have the submandibular glands that can be found right here under the mandible, and we have the sublingual glands that can be found right here under the tongue. Each of these glands are exocrine glands as they release their secretory products into ducts that will dump out into the mouth. As their name suggests, the salivary glands secrete saliva, which contains a very special enzyme known as salivary amylase. Amylase is the digestive enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates. It is because of this enzyme that the process of chemical digestion of carbohydrates begins before we've even swallowed our food. We will talk more about chemical digestion in just a few slides. As already previously mentioned, the tongue forms the floor of the oral cavity and helps facilitate the process of chewing, swallowing, and speaking. And the tongue will also contain taste buds, but this structure is more likely to be covered in the special senses lab. The only thing that I need to mention about the teeth is that they are specifically useful to facilitate the process of mechanical digestion in the mouth, and that an average adult will contain 32 permanent teeth. We are in fact born with 20 deciduous teeth that we will eventually lose and will be replaced by our permanent teeth during adolescence. We do have many different classifications for teeth, but we will leave it to the dentists to distinguish those differences. The idea that I have been alluding to thus far is that the process of mechanical digestion and the process of chemical digestion both actually begin in the mouth. To put definitions with each of these terms, mechanical digestion refers to the physical breakdown and churning up of food. This process turns food into a paste, which is referred to as a bolus. We do typically tend to think of mechanical digestion as being the major process that starts in the mouth. However, chemical digestion will in fact also begin taking place in the mouth as well. Chemical digestion more accurately describes the chemical breakdown of food from larger macromolecules into their smaller monomeric subunits. Salivary amylase and lingual lipase are 2 digestive enzymes that come from the salivary glands in the mouth. As I have already mentioned, amylase is the enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates from polysaccharides into disaccharides. Lingual lipase, on the other hand, is another digestive enzyme that acts on lipids that will break down dietary triglycerides into fatty acids and diglycerides. These 2 enzymes begin the process of chemical digestion the moment that saliva comes in contact with food in the mouth. So while we tend to consider the mouth as a location that primarily focuses upon mechanical digestion, the presence of salivary amylase and the presence of lingual lipase indicate that chemical digestion of food also begins in the mouth. So to summarize the components and functions of the mouth, we want to pay careful attention to the 3 salivary glands and also to the functions of the teeth and the tongue. The teeth and the tongue will be major players in the process of mechanical digestion, and the salivary glands will secrete the enzymes that are the drivers of chemical digestion. Salivary amylase will break down carbohydrates, while lingual lipase will break down triglycerides. Here are some pathological conditions that relate to the mouth and affect some of its components. Mumps, canker sores, and oral herpes are all conditions that affect this part of the digestive system. We have just now discussed how the mouth is the entry point for food into the digestive system. Once food is swallowed, it will pass into the pharynx and be channeled into the esophagus. The pharynx was previously discussed during the respiratory system as part of the throat that is shared between the digestive system and the respiratory system. Both food and air pass through the pharynx, and while air was channeled into the trachea, food will be channeled into the esophagus. We separate the pharynx into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, based upon the structures that the pharynx sits behind. The pharynx contains layers of skeletal muscles that will facilitate the beginning phases of deglutition. Deglutition is just a fancy word for swallowing, and we will discuss this process in just a few slides. Once food is brought back through the pharynx, it will hopefully enter the esophagus. The esophagus is the structure that lies between the pharynx and the stomach, connecting them and allowing for the passage of food into the stomach after we swallow. The esophagus will contain 3 of the 4 layers or tunics of the gastrointestinal tract. The esophagus will not have the serosa, as the serosa is an extension of the peritoneum. Since the esophagus is passing through the thoracic cavity to connect the pharynx to the stomach, it will not be wrapped in the peritoneum, as the peritoneum is only found in the abdominopelvic cavity. But all of the other layers of the GI tract will be found making up the walls of the esophagus. You can see this picture is depicting the esophagus for us, and we can see the inner mucosa shown right here. We have the submucosa, which sits just under the mucosa. This is going to be our connective tissue layer of the esophagus. And then we're going to have our muscularis externa, which is found out here. And hopefully we remember that the muscularis externa is made up of an inner circular layer of muscle and an outer longitudinal layer of muscle that will both facilitate 2 different actions in the digestive system. You can come up here and see this histological section of the mucosa shown right here. And in fact, the mucosa is a layer of stratified squamous epithelium, as the esophagus is a part of the digestive system that receives lots and lots of traffic. We have to have an extra protective layer of epithelium, as many hard and rough substances will be passing right next to this layer. We have our submucosa that can be found here, and in fact you'll also see the inner circular layer of the muscularis externa and the outer longitudinal layer of the muscularis externa. You can also actually see this difference in layers shown right here. You've got your inner circular layer shown right here, and your outer longitudinal layer, which can be seen wrapping around the inner circular layer. The main role of the esophagus is to get food from the pharynx into the stomach. So we will see the process of deglutition taking place in the esophagus, and that is facilitated by the muscularis externa. These layers of smooth muscle in the wall of the esophagus will be responsible for carrying out 2 of the 3 phases of deglutition. In case you missed it when I said it earlier, deglutition is just another word for swallowing. There are 3 stages of deglutition, namely the voluntary stage, the pharyngeal stage, and the esophageal stage. As the name suggests, the only voluntary stage of deglutition is in fact the voluntary stage. The other 2 stages of swallowing are primarily involuntary, meaning that they are carried out by smooth muscles in the walls of the esophagus. Smooth muscles, as we know, are primarily involuntary. The tongue specifically will be very important in the voluntary stage, as it will be used to move food to the back of the mouth and trigger the pharyngeal stage. Once food has made its way to the pharynx, the epiglottis will cover up the larynx, and our smooth muscles are going to take over. Breathing will cease during this phase, as the airway will be covered up by the epiglottis, and the upper esophageal sphincter will open and allow food into the esophagus. The third and final stage of deglutition is the esophageal stage. Thanks to the arrangement of the muscularis externa in the walls of the esophagus, the inner circular and outer longitudinal layers of muscles will work in coordination with each other to transport food down the esophagus and into the stomach. You can see here that the circular muscles will contract to close off the pathway up the esophagus, and the longitudinal muscles will contract in front of the bolus to shorten the overall length of the esophagus and propel food inferiorly down towards the stomach. Food will eventually pass through the lower esophageal sphincter, that separates the esophagus from the stomach, and this will complete the esophageal phase of deglutition. In summary, the pharynx directs food into the esophagus, which will take food directly into the stomach. The smooth muscles in the esophagus are going to be responsible for 2 of the 3 phases of deglutition, specifically the esophageal stage as well as the pharyngeal stage. During deglutition, the upper esophageal sphincter will relax so that food can enter the esophagus, and as food moves down the esophagus from the action of the muscularis externa, that's going to lead to the relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter. There will also be lots of mucus release in the esophagus to help lubricate contents as they pass into the stomach. The esophagus will also be lined with a layer of stratified squamous epithelium to protect the walls of this organ. 2 conditions related to the esophagus are gastroesophageal reflux and a hiatal hernia. Gastroesophageal reflux is often commonly referred to as heartburn. With gastroesophageal reflux, acid from the stomach moves up the esophagus and erodes the mucosa of this organ. The inner lining of the esophagus is not adapted for the highly acidic nature of the secretions coming from the stomach. If allowed to persist long enough, this can ultimately lead to a condition known as Barrett's esophagus, which is precancerous. Our other pathological condition is a hiatal hernia. A hiatal hernia is when part of the stomach projects up through the diaphragm into the thoracic cavity. This can also lead to gastroesophageal reflux as a result, or perhaps difficulty swallowing. So the stomach will be the next component of the alimentary canal after the esophagus. The stomach and the esophagus are separated by the lower esophageal sphincter. The stomach is roughly shaped like the letter J, and it is a gross enlargement of the alimentary canal. The stomach has 4 separate regions. We have the cardia, which can be found right here, which is where all food will have to pass before it enters the stomach. We have the fundus of the stomach, which can be shown right here, projecting superiorly. The body of the stomach, which is in fact the largest of the stomach regions, can be seen right here. And lastly, we have the pylorus of the stomach, which you can see here. This is the last region of the stomach before the digested bolus, which at this point will be referred to as chyme, will leave the stomach and enter into the small intestine. We will also note that the stomach has a very specialized muscularis externa, and it will also have some interesting structures in the mucosa as well. The muscularis externa of the stomach will have both a circular layer of muscle and a longitudinal layer of muscle. However, we're also going to see that the stomach will have a third muscular layer known as the oblique layer. This third layer of muscle will work together with the other 2 to churn up food and further the process of mechanical digestion. The muscle fibers of the longitudinal layer, the circular layer, and the oblique layer are all in different directions, which maximizes the movement for mechanical digestion in the stomach. Hydrochloric acid will be released from certain cells inside of the stomach and will need to be mixed in with the bolus that is coming from the esophagus. It is the specialized muscularis externa that does this. The mucosa of the stomach also has a very intriguing characteristic that we do not see anywhere else in the digestive system. You can see that the inner lining of the stomach forms these folds of mucosa. These structures are called rugae, and they are present on the inside of the stomach to help the stomach stretch when food enters into the stomach. The stomach is an organ that is known as distensible, which means that it has the capability of being stretched. The stomach serves as a food reservoir and slowly releases its contents into the first part of the small intestine. I mentioned earlier that the stomach produces a substance known as chyme, which is essentially just referring to a digested bolus. Chyme is slowly leaked out of the pylorus of the stomach through what is known as the pyloric sphincter, and the pyloric sphincter separates the stomach from the small intestine. Now, most of these functions of the stomach I have just mentioned. The enlarged size of the stomach functions as a reservoir for food storage as it is being digested. The 3 muscular layers in the muscularis externa of the stomach will be tasked with mixing up the bolus with all of the secretions that came in from the mouth and the stomach itself. I did already mention that hydrochloric acid is released from certain cells in the stomach. However, this is not the only component of gastric juice. Pepsin, intrinsic factor, and gastric lipase are all constituents of the secretions of the stomach, and each substance is going to play its own role in facilitating either digestion or absorption. Gastrin is another substance that is released by the cells in the stomach that actually functions as a hormone to activate what is known as the gastric phase of digestion. Gastric refers to the stomach, so this is the phase of digestion that takes place inside of the stomach. We will see that the mucosa of the stomach has a variety of cells that will each contribute their own products to the gastric juice that will be used to accelerate digestion in the stomach. The mucosa of the stomach consists of 5 different cells that are arranged into gastric pits, which you can see here found along the entirety of the inside of the stomach. Gastric pits will dive down into the mucosa of the stomach and house the many different stomach cells that are producing the components of gastric juice. These cells will release hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, pepsinogen, gastric lipase, and gastrin, as well as mucus that will coat the inner lining of the stomach and protect it from the low pH in the lumen. There are 5 epithelial cells in the stomach, and they include the surface mucus cells, the mucus neck cells, the parietal cells, the chief cells, and the G cells. As their name suggests, the surface mucus cells and the mucus neck cells will be found toward the top of the gastric pits, and they will be secreting mucus that will coat the inner lining of the stomach, which protects the epithelium from the hydrochloric acid that's secreted by this organ. We will conversely find the G cells at the base of the gastric pits, secreting the hormone gastrin. The parietal cells and the chief cells have 2 secretory products each, and can be found about midway up the gastric pits in the stomach. The parietal cells release hydrochloric acid, as well as a molecule known as intrinsic factor, and the chief cells will release gastric lipase and another chemical known as pepsinogen. Let us further elaborate on what each of these secretions do and how they contribute to digestion in the stomach. The surface mucus cells and the mucus neck cells can be found secreting mucus. As other cells in the stomach are secreting hydrochloric acid, we have to have a barrier that will protect the epithelium of the stomach from the acid that is in the lumen. Most of our body tissues are not well adapted to deal with extremely low pHs. And while the stomach is an exception to this rule, the epithelial lining of the stomach can still be damaged if exposed to hydrochloric acid. And so, it is the primary job of the surface mucus cells and the mucus neck cells to produce this protective barrier that will ensure that hydrochloric acid in the stomach does not eat away at the stomach lining. The parietal cells are in fact the players that the mucus is protecting us from. These cells produce both hydrochloric acid and another substance known as intrinsic factor. We should understand that hydrochloric acid plays a big role in the digestion of contents in the stomach. Extremely low pHs will unfold and denature proteins, and also present a challenge for potential pathogens that are trying to infect us through the proximal end of the digestive tube. We should remember from the presentation on the lymphatic and the immune system that there will be lysozymes in the saliva. In the event that microbes make it past the salivary lysozyme, they will then have to overcome the hurdle of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, which is very, very likely to destroy them as soon as they make their way into the stomach. One other role that hydrochloric acid plays in digestion is that this molecule will also convert the inactive molecule pepsinogen that's secreted by our chief cells into its active form known as pepsin. When activated, pepsin catabolizes proteins into smaller peptide chains. So we can hopefully see just how integral hydrochloric acid is to the function of the stomach and the protection of the body. But hydrochloric acid is not the only secretory product of our parietal cells. We also see that the parietal cells are releasing another chemical known as intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is a critical player in the absorption of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 cannot be synthesized by the body, and therefore we must get this vitamin from the diet. But the problem is that vitamin B12 cannot be absorbed by the body on its own. It will need to be bound to intrinsic factor so that we can take in the vitamin B12 intrinsic factor complex instead. Overall, the parietal cells aid in both digestion with the use of hydrochloric acid and absorption with the use of intrinsic factor. Our next stomach cells that we are going to discuss are the chief cells. The chief cells also secrete two products, namely pepsinogen and gastric lipase. We have just seen that pepsinogen from the chief cells will eventually be converted into pepsin, its active form, by the hydrochloric acid that was released by the parietal cells. Pepsin will then go on to break down proteins. But the other product that comes from our chief cells is known as gastric lipase. As we saw with lingual lipase, lipase is in fact the enzyme that's going to catalyze the breakdown of triglycerides into fatty acids and monoglycerides. Triglycerides are lipids, and they are made up of a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids. Gastric lipase will share the same function as lingual lipase that came from our salivary glands. However, this enzyme is specifically coming from the chief cells of the stomach, hence why we call it gastric lipase. The last stomach cells to discuss are the G cells. The G cells release the hormone known as gastrin, and I mentioned earlier that gastrin is going to facilitate the gastric phase of digestion. This is when the stomach activity is going to pick up and accelerate digestion in the stomach specifically. 3 events that are taking place during the gastric phase of digestion refer to the contraction of the lower esophageal sphincter, increased stomach motility, and the relaxation of the pyloric sphincter. Thinking about this, the lower esophageal sphincter needs to close tightly to prevent gastroesophageal reflux, as the movement of the walls of the stomach will be increasing, making backward movements of substances more likely. At the same time, the pyloric sphincter needs to relax to allow substances to leak out into the small intestine. Gastrin is going to be the main stimulus that will signal the parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid and will signal the chief cells to release pepsinogen. So to summarize the digestive activities that take place in the stomach, the 3-layered muscularis externa will mix the gastric juice with the bolus that has entered in from the esophagus. This process produces the acidic chyme that will slowly leak into the small intestine. The pyloric sphincter will regulate this flow and also prevent backflow once substances have made their way into the small intestine. So a couple of pathologies that we see related to the stomach are gastritis and gastric ulcers. Gastritis refers to the inflammation of the stomach lining, and we should be getting much more comfortable with terms such as this one. The suffix itis will mean inflammation, and since gastro refers to the stomach, gastritis means inflammation of the stomach. Gastric ulcers are another pathology that we see related to this part of the alimentary canal. Gastric ulcers refer to areas where the stomach lining has been eroded or removed. If for some reason the stomach acid is able to move past the mucus and come in contact with the stomach's epithelium, this can cause potential issues. Gastric ulcers can often be caused by an increase in the hydrochloric acid or perhaps a decrease in the stomach mucus secretions. Spicy foods, coffee, and excessive ibuprofen can all lead to these parameters. One other thing that can cause gastric ulcers is the microbe known as Helicobacter pylori. This bacteria is actually able to survive in the very low acidic environment that the stomach provides. This bug can burrow down into the mucus and affect the stomach lining, leading to the ulcer. In the event that the stomach ulcer is caused by Helicobacter pylori, antibiotics will be the go-to medication to heal this condition. But oftentimes, acid-reducing drugs will be used in the event that the ulcer was caused by stress or an acid imbalance. So now that we've looked over the anatomy of the stomach, as well as the cells of the epithelium of the stomach and their secretions, we're now going to take a look at the 3 phases of digestion. So the 3 phases of digestion that we're going to distinguish are on this slide. The first phase of digestion is known as the cephalic phase, the second phase is known as the gastric phase, and the third phase is known as the intestinal phase. The cephalic phase is actually started before food has even entered the mouth. The cephalic phase is started when we see or smell food, and this phase marks our body's preparation for ingestion. Salivation and initial secretion of digestive enzymes will occur during this phase. The second phase is the gastric phase, which, as I have mentioned, is facilitated by the hormone gastrin, which came from the G cells in the stomach. Gastrin will constrict the lower esophageal sphincter, increase stomach motility, and also relax the pyloric sphincter so that acidic chyme can move its way into the intestines. It will also stimulate the release of hydrochloric acid from the parietal cells of the stomach lining and pepsinogen from the chief cells as well. Stimuli that trigger the gastric phase of digestion to begin are distension, which is the stretching of the stomach wall, from food that has entered from the esophagus, or perhaps by a decrease in the acidity levels in the stomach due to proteins that are entering from the lower esophageal sphincter. You can see the feedback loop on the right side of this page is going to walk us through this gastric phase of digestion. So you can see that when food enters into the stomach, that's eventually going to increase the pH inside of the stomach, making our gastric juice more basic, and that's also going to increase distension, which will be the stretching of the walls of the stomach. More food entering into the stomach means more stretching on the stomach walls. Chemoreceptors sensing for pH and stretch receptors that are sensing stretch in the stomach are going to recognize these changes in stimuli. And through parasympathetic innervation, they're going to cause two different effects to take place. First and foremost, we're going to increase stomach motility by further contracting the muscularis externa of the stomach. But along with this, we're also going to stimulate our parietal cells to release more hydrochloric acid. When these two effects come together, the additional hydrochloric acid will restore the pH in the stomach back to normal, back to a much lower pH, and the increased motility of the stomach is going to mix that hydrochloric acid in with all of the basic proteins that have entered into the stomach also. By way of these two responses, we're going to increase the acidity, which also is the decrease in pH of the contents inside of the stomach, and that's also going to increase the mixing of the stomach contents as well. And from this, we produce the substance known as chyme, which will leave and go into the small intestine. Once chyme has been formed by the mixing of gastric juice with the bolus by the muscularis externa, it is going to slowly flow into the small intestine, and the intestinal phase of digestion is going to begin. In the small intestine, absorption and digestion will further increase. Hormones such as secretin and cholecystokinin will inhibit the action of gastrin and eventually feed back on the pyloric sphincter to constrict it. This helps to further regulate the flow of chyme into the small intestine so that the intestines can have adequate time to fully digest and absorb its contents.